Well, this is perfect timing because we've got UNC Chapel Hill Professor Graeme Robertson speaking of these dialogues that have been underway here to try to, I guess, achieve some sort of relief, if not total peace in Ukraine. Graeme Robertson, political science professor, but also someone who has done a lot of research and a lot of boning up, if you will, on what is going on in Eastern Europe. You also look at authoritarian regimes, so you've been kind of watching the dynamics in this region for quite some time. Any takeaways from what we've seen thus far today, Graeme, regarding these meetings with the Ukrainian president and President Trump?
Well, I think, just the photo ops that you were talking about themselves, I think are really powerful and interesting. So a couple of takeaways. One is that Zelenskyy showed up in a suit, not a tie this time, but with a suit nonetheless. Seems trivial, but it's actually a significant change from the way he typically dresses for international travel. Normally he wears military fatigues. And that to me is a sign of his the importance of winning support from the U.S. president for Ukraine and for President Zelenskyy personally. He's willing to go that extra little mile symbolically, knowing that these symbols matter a lot to President Trump, and he's willing to do that. The other thing that I think is really powerful is the number of European leaders that have shown up to mobilize leaders in this number and leaders of this stature. We have the president of France, we have the prime minister of the UK, Italy, Finland, we have the head of NATO. All these people showing up in the middle of their August vacations is pretty dramatic and shows how incredibly important this issue is for the Europeans.
Yeah, I mean, you brought up the suit. You mentioned, it seems like a small point, but we know in that last sit down, which I believe was in February, was the last time that they had sat down like this and folks were watching this. This was being televised, this meeting. There was a criticism about what he was wearing from some. And there was also a point that was brought up about how, he allegedly didn't thank the U.S. enough for what it has done to support Ukraine through this war. And we were actually seeing during the sit down today more of that thanking, if you will. There was a letter that was from First Lady Melania Trump that was given to him, asking him to protect the children. And he thanked her for that. From my understanding, it sounds like European leaders actually coached him a bit in how to handle this current sit down that we're seeing right now.
Yeah, so in Europe, the Italian Prime Minister, Giorgia Meloni, she has a reputation for being what they call a Trump whisperer. And so I'm sure she's also been to the surprise of many, a very strong advocate for Ukraine. So I wouldn't be at all surprised if she had words with Zelenskyy. Also, Keir Starmer, the British Prime Minister, is known for having a particularly good relationship personally with Trump. And I'm sure they were all working together to try and maximize. I know there was discussions amongst the Europeans about how best to present themselves. Do they all speak? Do they appoint one person to speak on their behalf? All of these different, very detailed issues of presentation, I think, have been addressed in the last, really in the last 48 hours.
I'm just kind of curious, your take on the optics of this meeting today compared to Friday. There was a lot of analysis, people reading into things by seeing how Russian President Vladimir Putin was treated upon his arrival in Alaska with like a literal red carpet rolled out, the ride in the presidential limo. And I think we were hearing, based on some of the reports that we were seeing from, our international reporters with NBC News, that there was somewhat of a dismay with Ukrainians watching this, seeing how Russia's leader was being treated. I guess what could you say as far as the optics of that versus the optics of this, and whether you can really read into something like that in a case like this?
So I was watching that very closely. I was, like many others, was dismayed on Friday to see the leader of the United States welcoming on the red carpet an accused war criminal. Putin is wanted in 125 countries for war crimes that include the deportation of and abduction of children. And that for Ukrainians must have been incredibly hard to swallow. And I know that to stop this war, you have to talk to Putin, clearly. But there's ways of doing it, and I think that was really tough for people to see on Friday. The welcome at the White House is a different kind of a setup. The incoming presidents and prime ministers of the U.S.'s closest allies are met by the head of protocol. I understand that is actually standard protocol, and so that is sort of more the kind of thing you would expect to see. And so I wouldn't read too much into the difference between the two, but certainly the way Putin was greeted on Friday was intended to send a message that he's not an international pariah and that he's back in the international community. And I think, that is very difficult for a lot of people to stomach.
No, I mean, the other point that I see coming up pretty frequently, in recent days, the fact that there seems to be more of a stronger messaging about the potential that Ukraine may be asked to give up some of its land, to cede some of its land in order to receive peace, ultimate peace, at least for some time. Right. And I'm just curious your take, knowing kind of all of the historical context behind this, maybe even some of like the logistical and practical ways that might actually look. Right. I'm just curious what that would look like in reality and what that would mean, on a global scale.
So it's very, very complicated. It's very difficult for the Ukrainians to make these kinds of concessions. One thing is that I just conducted my own nationally representative opinion poll in Ukraine, just finished it last week, and we asked people about their willingness to trade territory for peace. And while people are very interested in peace, they're not interested in general in trading territory. You have to remember that hundreds of thousands of people have died at the front line. We don't know how many in the Ukrainian case, but we know the numbers are very, very substantial to defend the territory that they've been defending. And so to turn around and then cede some of that land that they have successfully defended to Russia is a very bitter pill to swallow. Secondly, one of the reasons why the Ukraine has been able to defend that land is that they built serious fortifications across Donetsk. Just walking back from those and retreating to a much less defensible position also seems, from a strategic perspective, to be a real challenge. So getting the military to actually do that is a big risk, and a big risk for Zelenskyy politically. There are very strong factions within the Ukrainian military who don't want to make these kinds of compromises, and Zelenskyy would have to try and somehow sell that, and I think it's a huge ask.
I would imagine too that there might be maybe some qualms from a general global perspective too, that maybe there might be countries that would say, well, this is the ultimate result of all of this fighting. Right. Would that really deter Russia from, trying this again?
So since 1945, the Europeans came to a settlement essentially of, they had three major wars in less than 100 years between France and Germany. And the way that was solved was by the creation of the European Union and an agreement that borders would not be changed by force. And that's been a guiding principle. It's not always been honored, but it's been a guiding principle of European security ever since. And so it's a huge deal for the Europeans to maintain that principle. The United States, the current administration, has shown much less care about borders and to see them as much more flexible and fungible and changeable. And so I think there is a difference of opinion there, where for the Europeans, changing borders is a really serious matter. And it has implications for all sorts of other potential conflicts and points of dispute, between Russia and NATO countries like Estonia. And so it's a Pandora's box that the Europeans are very, very keen to keep closed.
As someone who clearly has, made a life and a career out of studying, this particular realm, not only of, international relations, if you will, historical context. How pivotal is this moment that we're living right now in comparison to maybe, looking back over the decades and decades of international relations that have occurred around this specific region? How interesting is this to you, as someone who's kind of a student of that topic?
Yeah. I've been doing this for over 40 years, and I've never gotten bored with this region. There's always something happening, but this is definitely on a scale that's as big as anything that's happened since the end of the Cold War, since the Soviet Union collapsed at the end of 1991. And the new Russia emerged within different borders, and 14 new countries emerged on the 50 new countries on the territory if you include Russia. And so this is of that kind of proportion. It's an effort by Russia to reestablish its former borders. And it was no coincidence that the Russian foreign minister, Sergei Lavrov, showed up in Alaska wearing a T-shirt that had the letters SSSR, which is Russian for the Soviet Union, on his shirt. That was not an accident. And this idea of rebuilding the USSR, they're part of the imagery around the war that Putin has pushed, is a picture of a Soviet soldier atop the Reichstag, and the slogan is, "We can make it happen again." So this is really a Russia that sees itself as rising as a military power and as a political power, and is intent on regaining some of the territory it lost control over during the collapse of the Soviet Union. So it's incredibly important that Russia fail to do this in Ukraine. Otherwise, it'll set a really dangerous precedent going forward.
Now, I mean, one of the points that I've seen in recent reporting is the fact that the president, President Trump, he really does potentially have quite a few cards to play if there was, true will to maybe hit Russia where it hurts. I'd seen perhaps, tariffs on India that might inadvertently, hurt Russia and or cut off some funding supplies. I guess how many cards do you think the president truly holds to kind of bend this in a certain direction? And if there are quite a few cards, why might he potentially be holding back on using those?
Right. I think we have fewer cards than we like to think. We have U.S. presidents going back to Obama have used sanctions as a tool against Russia, completely ineffectively. The Russians have adapted. It's been costly for them economically, but it hasn't done anything to weaken the regime. And in fact, Putin's regime is stronger now than it's ever been since before the sanctions. So I think we're sort of we love the idea of economic levers, because then we can do it without too much damage to ourselves, without too much risk. But I think in reality the economic levers are limited, which leaves you with military support. And we did give the Ukrainians very significant military support. It did help to change the direction of the war. We've since dialed that back down. We're now letting the Ukrainians buy weapons rather than providing them for free, and that makes that's weakened their hand significantly. And Russia has adapted militarily dramatically. So I think while the U.S. could play a big role in providing security guarantees and military support, it's really in that sphere that we do have some influence rather than in the economic sphere.
So we wanted to point out here, Graeme, that one of the feeds that we've been watching, it looks like now we do have the president who has now stepped out. We're actually going to show folks over our chat here some of this video. So this is live as we speak here on Live Impact News. We can see on his side to his right, President Trump's right, as he's facing the camera. So our left here on the screen, we do have Volodymyr Zelenskyy, and then filing kind of in a line from left to right, we have other world leaders. So they're doing this photo op as we speak right now. And our understanding, based on some of the scheduling that our reporting partners have received with NBC News, it sounds like there's going to be a bit of a photo op here at this moment, and then there will be more of a discussion with other European leaders. I guess what will you be watching to see after they emerge from this meeting? What sort of either visual tones and or messaging will you be on the lookout, to see later today?
Right. So I think there's two big issues that we might see some progress on. One is this question of whether or not we're going to pursue a ceasefire first, or whether we need a whole peace deal, and allowing the fighting to continue while we pursue this peace deal. That is, that the Russians want to keep fighting. They don't want a ceasefire. And the Ukrainians want a ceasefire, and the Europeans want a ceasefire. So I think part of the purpose of this visit is to try and stiffen President Trump's spine on this issue. President Trump was pretty strong on the need for a ceasefire before he met with Putin in Alaska, and that seems to have been dropped as a result of his interactions with Putin in Alaska. So it'll be interesting to see what reference, if any, is made to ceasefires when they come back out. The other big issue is security guarantees. The Europeans understand that they will be providing the main sort of practical security guarantees for Ukraine in the event of a peace treaty going forward, or a ceasefire going forward. But they will need to have those backed up by the United States. The United States is by far the most powerful military power at the table. And President Trump over the weekend actually indicated that he would be willing to do that, and was very vague about what that would actually mean in practice. But it would be really interesting to see to what extent there are any more details about that role and what the United States is willing to do on that front.
Yeah, I mean, definitely. I mean, I agree with you. Some really interesting dynamics here that we're watching right now. As we pointed out, for folks who are watching here on Live Impact News, we've got various feeds that we're keeping an eye on. Of course, just moments ago, we brought you the photo op with all the world leaders in attendance, and it looks like we're getting another feed from a different room where, if I had to guess, this is just based on some of the scheduling that we provided, this might be the sit down where we have the president meeting with the rest of the European leaders. So we'll definitely have that for folks here on Live Impact. Graeme, we thank you so much for your time here. Any other insights you want to leave us with just on this overall topic, things that you really feel like viewers really need to know as we continue to watch this dynamic and this dialogue throughout the day, and of course in days and probably weeks and months to come?
Yeah, so I think my big takeaway over the last few days, and thank you for your time and the opportunity, has been that President Putin hasn't changed his negotiating position in months and months. And the offer that he made to trade peace for land that Russia has not yet taken, that's an offer you can't accept. You've heard the expression, offer you can't refuse, but this is one that Zelenskyy clearly can't accept, and Putin understands that. And that tells me that the Russians are not serious about having a deal. They're serious about continuing to fight, and they're serious about trying to kick these talks into the long grass and slow things down. And while that remains to be the case, then the prospects of peace are pretty slim.
Yeah. Well, Graeme Robertson, we really appreciate your insights and your perspectives here. We definitely love to have you back here on Live Impact. Of course, we know this dialogue is going to continue. So we're always interested in making our viewers just a little bit more smarter about the topic. So thank you. We'll be in touch.
My pleasure. Thank you so much.
All right.
Bye.